And it's Downbelow. I'm Ian.
I'm Steve.
So, last time we talked about why people have a certain kind of unmet need for higher level fulfillment in their lives. Let's talk about how they seek to engage themselves in that area of their lives.
I mentioned last time that a lot of times to get that fulfillment that they don't even realize they need, they will often take senseless risks. In today's world, this usually leads to youth going out and clubbing, socializing with friends, other not necessarily poor decisions, but potentially poor decisions being made. Well, the youth these days who are full-time employed have relatively few hours per week compared to our future generations where they might have upwards of 20 hours per day unspoken for.
So the average person's off-the-wall engagements are going to include things like sports or other more traditionally leisure activities. For characters in your Downbelow game, though, the interesting things that they might get engaged in will be more active in nature.
We're probably not talking about people who spend 3 hours a day at the gym because it helps them feel better, or who have an avid rock climbing career. We're talking about people who are often way more thrill-seeking and or illicit than this.
So they might have started with something more mundane, but the reason that many illicit trades and illegal activities go on in the world of Downbelow is that there are plenty of people seeking an out from a mundane existence that merely lets them survive.
Let's face it, isn't that one of the reasons that we play a lot of these role-playing games in the first place, especially the cyberpunk-style ones? It's much, much more interesting for us to imagine what would we do in a world like this. Instead of saying, well, I would probably still be shackled to a desk working for a corporation, no, of course I'd be a high-speed courier. Yes, absolutely I'd be the kung fu expert who can break into this place.
One thing that modern psychology has been looking into, for example, is that the primary source of dissatisfaction for a lot of suburban people with their jobs is the commute. Blank periods of time are bad for the human psyche. And in the world of Downbelow, people who are having their subsistence paid for and who don't have something to do with the majority of their time are faced with the choice between basically having lots of blank time or making up something to do with it.
Sometimes this is actually a very natural progression. There's a character who has an avid aficionado for rock climbing. They spend their blank time climbing rocks. But eventually they get so good that the local rocks are no longer a challenge, and they start seeking out greater challenges. Sooner or later this could very easily turn into trespassing on places they are not supposed to go, and that might attract the attention of both legal authorities and illegal authorities. The criminal syndicate might say this person is quite skilled at breaking into places because they are seeking to climb rocks, and so they break into nature preserves. Before you know it, they're delivering and couriering things up the sides of steep buildings because they can.
But why is there a criminal syndicate in the first place? Well, for one thing, people who are seeking to fill that blank space, some of them, in fact, most of them, are not actually as ambitious as the rock climber we just mentioned. There is a large market for illicit substances.
For an excellent example of this, let's look no further than the original Matrix. When it opens, we see Mr. Anderson, who happens to be well employed at a software firm, but is making a lot of money on the side by selling illicit copies of his firm's product.
And in that same movie, we see a character who has decided that knowing the truth is not as good as living the lie in luxury. There are people who seek out illicit substances and technologies, not so much that are illicit to own or use at all, but in illicit ways or amounts. And these are things like opiates or some brain stimulation technologies which allow people to basically tune out and turn off for those long blank periods they would otherwise be faced with.
Why not replace the blankness with comfortable blankness instead?
Now, society would prefer that these people, although there is a certain amount of recreational drug use and recreational blankness allowed and tolerated and medically
and
controlled
in general, as long as it happens with entirely including consenting adults in the privacy of your own home, there is no issue.
There is a preference in societies for people to actually do something productive with their time, but this is where the cracks in the system start to show themselves, because the incentive structures are broken in this world. They look okay on the surface, but they have allowed for these people who are purveying the blank bliss to grow up in the cracks, and that is one place that characters in your Downbelow game might come from. Either the people who they are seeking something to cover that blankness and their supply has run short, or maybe they're part of the scheme providing it. So thanks for listening to this episode of what people might need and how they get it outside the system. We'll have more for you about where the cracks are and why these make interesting characters next time. Thanks for delving into those cracks with us.